glad to have you guys here. With a show of hands, how many guys are technical enough that you guys get into S3 and then do some type of configuration changes or create S3 buckets? Not you. You don't count. And then how many are you guys like look at your environment and see what's going on in the environment? Like, how many EC2 instances you guys have? Or, okay, great. That's great. What I really wanted to showcase today is how you can secure not only Amazon S3 buckets, right? But also look at audit and look at compliance through following AWS's Amazon's well-architected framework, right? So the first thing I want to do is let's ask ourselves some questions, right? With a show of hands, we saw that, hey, some of you guys go into S3, some of you guys go, look at the environment as a whole. So a few questions to kind of ask yourself: do I have enough information to audit and validate, your security policies, right? Can you today go in and see how many S3 buckets you have? What are the policies? Is anything encrypted? Is S3 bucket public? Or what's going on inside the S3 bucket, right? Now, all this information is great to know, but what are you going to do with that information? That's also another aspect, right? So security is not just knowing, but also doing and figuring out how you can mitigate some of these risks that you might have in Amazon, right? And then lastly, you want to know, hey, if you have something that you can mitigate, is that going to cause me performance issues, availability issues, right? So we're going to get into all of that using your Amazon account, right? Now, to answer some of these questions, these are some 4 basic questions, right? So to answer some of these questions, we're going to look at a Amazon architecture that's recommended by Amazon. So this architecture is like a happy path architecture, shows you exactly what Amazon recommends to create some type of architecture using Lambda functions, right? Serverless functions and S3 environment, S3 buckets, right? It's a pretty simple architecture where you have your front end, it could be your phone, right? You're uploading images. So here you can see you're uploading some images straight into S3 bucket. You might be uploading it using a Lambda function right here, a serverless function, right? And then once you upload this image, you might be doing some type of business logic, right? Where maybe it's a meme, right? And you put some text on it, and then you showcase that back out to another user, right? So pretty simple architecture, right? Now, following this Amazon's recommended architecture, this happy path architecture, you can save on cost, you can save on performance, high performance, right? High availability because you're using serverless and S3 buckets, right? And then on top of that, you have availability and low maintenance, right? Now, all this is because of serverless functions and S3 buckets, but let's see what type of basic security rules we should have, right? So you have an architecture. This is what we want to achieve. What type of basic security rules we should have, right? Here you can see some basic security rules. So you have these security rules such as, hey, I want to make sure that my bucket cannot be accessed by just anybody. Certain people have access to buckets. Or you want to make sure your bucket is not public, right? Sometimes developers make code change, and all of a sudden that S3 bucket becomes public. What happened in that case, right? Do you have the access to remediate that action, or it all starts with visibility? Do you even have that visibility to do this, right? And not only that, but verifying what goes in your bucket. So I'm taking a picture, right, and I'm uploading it to an S3 bucket. How do we know that this S3 bucket, that picture that I put in, has malware in it or not, right? Down the road, if I'm doing some business logic and malware comes in, all of a sudden you have this malware. A computer could be infected, could be ransomware, could be anything, right? Now these are just some basic security questions, but all this is all around after you have already created this environment, right? So this is all afterwards. You have already created the environment. That architecture is already there. You're kind of doing this from a configuration standpoint, right? What we want to do is take that security and move it to the left. So move it to more in terms of security and the developers, right? And we want to make it as easy as possible from the developer's perspective, right? So when the architecture is built, it's already secure, right? So let's take a look at how a shift left kind of looks like, which is making that architecture more for the developers, making that security more for the developers, right? Here, what we want to do is look at a couple of different things, such as, hey, can we put it into the developing tools that the developers are using, right? Tools such as maybe they're doing VS Code, right? That's what the tool they use to create that code, right? Can we use that platform itself to make it easy for the developers to see what they're coding as they're coding in real time, tell them that, hey, your configurations are messed up, right? Your S3 bucket might be public. Your EC2 instance might be in the wrong subnet and so forth, right? How easily we can do that. And then once you have that, is there some remediation actions that can be done, right? So let's take a look at how we can do this from start to finish, right? Now here's a simple example of a developer creating some code, right? They use VS Code to create the code. The code is then put into a repository. Using the CI/CD pipeline, they use and build serverless functions, virtual machines, instances, and storage, right? Very simple, right? Let's start, instead of just looking at it from this side, I wanted to start the process from when the developers are creating the code, right? So code level, they're using VS Code. Let's have a plugin, so as they're typing in, they realize, hey, these are my misconfigurations. I can update these configurations, right? If they don't have VS Code and they put in the code into the repository, right? When they're doing the CI/CD pipeline, right? Using APIs, you can quickly check that, hey, this code is malicious, or sorry, not malicious, but has configuration changes, right? Now, this itself gives you visibility before the architecture is even built, right? So how does this look and feel when we create that architecture that I showed you, right? That happy path architecture, right? Now you have a streamlined process from the code when it's built, right? Looking at configuration changes. Like I have customers who have 90 accounts in AWS. How are you going to validate each and every account, right? You want to validate each and every account, but not from when the environment is built. You want to start that process before the environment is built, right? So we start that process here. We build the environment. Now you have built the environment. Now you want to actually do checks on it, checks and balances on it, audit it on a real-time basis, right? That's where you have a tool such as conformity comes in and says, hey, looking at a well-architected framework, I can monitor this environment that I have built, right? I can monitor it, and I can look at what's actually happening if things change in real time, right? So from a configuration perspective and misconfiguration perspective, you have visibility in real time. So if there's any code changes that are happening, let's say there's let's say I have a new feature that's coming out, right? Where as user uploading images, they're putting their memes on top and making changes to the images, right? That's a new feature that came out. That came in from the code level, right, all the way down. And when they made that feature, they accidentally made this S3 bucket public, right? That means that you're not able to only access this S3 bucket from your application or from your phone, but anybody on the internet can go into the S3 bucket and put in anything they want, right? Which could mess up your business logic downstream. So because you have some tool, a cloud posture management tool, now you can, when that change happens, S3 bucket becomes public, you have a way of knowing that, hey, it became public. You'll quickly get that answer, right? You'll have a way to remediate that, right? And you can do auto remediation that, hey, it became public in real time, you know about it, and it automatically comes in and changes that public to private, right? So this is a great way to have a visibility, access to your environment, right? So if we go back to our questions, right, we're answering the first three questions right away, right? Do I have audit and validate? Right? You can quickly do that from the code level all the way to infrastructure level, right? Do I have visibility when changes occur? So developer made some changes, and now you can go in and quickly see what changes, if there are any misconfigurations to those changes, right? And then again, development team can be aligned with security policies, right? So that's going back to adding a plugin for VS Code, making sure that you have that ability for developers to know if there are any misconfigurations when they're creating that code, right? The last but not least is this workflow of malicious content. You know, all this content that's going into S3 buckets, how do I make sure that it's not malicious today, right? So let's take a look at that Happy Path architecture again. And here now you can see there's some changes that has happened into your S3 environment, right? What you're looking at is I have an upload bucket, a separate bucket, right? An upload bucket. Everything goes in here. Some Lambda function starts, and then you have a promote bucket and a quarantine bucket, right? Which makes sense that, hey, everything gets uploaded here. We don't know if things are malicious or not, right? Right now, we're only uploading images, but maybe there's a code change and a feature update. Now you're uploading videos also, right? How do you know those videos are not malicious? Maybe somebody came in and uploading a malicious video where it has malware inside that video content itself, right? Everything's code anyways in the backend, right? So now you're scanning this bucket and making sure that any content within that bucket, any files, any PDF files or video files are not malicious. If they're not malicious, they go into promote bucket, right? If they're malicious, they go to quarantine bucket. Okay, we're not even going to use these files so that our business logic does not get messed up, right? Pretty simple, right? Pretty simple. We want to scan whatever's going into that S3 bucket. But how do we want to go about it is using a modern architecture, right? Not use a legacy architecture, right? So I showed you the architecture using S3, Lambda, and so forth, right? Now, we want to use that modern architecture so that you have the best of breed performance and availability. If you use things like EC2 instances, what happens is you have to have the EC2 instances warm, making sure that they're always up and running. You need to run these files and scan these files quickly, right, on demand. And having those EC2 instances running is going to rack up cost, right? And once that racks up cost, now what you're doing is spending money for idle EC2 instances, right? And that happens all the time. We have customers where EC2 instances are running just to scan some file, but a file might be too big. Let's say if it's a 2 terabyte file, right? A video file could be a 2 terabyte video file. Well, in those cases, that EC2 instance is running, but now you're transferring that file from the S3 bucket into your EC2 instance, again, racking up cost, right? So it's not efficient, right? On top of that, you have performance issues. If it's a large file, the large file copying over to an EC2 instance and then running that process, it's going to be slow, right? So with trend solution, you can do all this using a better architecture, right? And that better architecture is going to be all around Lambda functions, S3, SQS, and SNS, right? Now, I know this is getting too much in detail, but what you need to realize here is that you have your storage and you have your scanners, right? The scanners will talk to your storage every time a new file is entered in, right? A new file comes in, the scanner automatically scans it, right? And the scanning is happening in your S3 bucket. You don't have to worry about, hey, I'm taking this file outside of my environment. That could be a compliancy issue, right? If your file leaves your S3 environment or your AWS environment, that's a compliance issue, and you might have to answer to somebody else for that, right? So we're not taking anything out. It's automatically, whenever on-demand, automatic, whenever a new file comes into S3 bucket, it's automatically scanned, right? And then again, depending if the file is malicious or not, it goes into quarantine bucket, right? Pretty simple. That happy path architecture still stays happy, and there aren't any malicious files going around, right? Now this is great, and I talked about performance over and over again, and I don't know how many of you guys watched the NFL game last night. Was there one? Yep, two. But those games, those NFL games, are usually, we have a big customer that uses those NFL games, and those are all videos, right? We want to make sure those performance is up to par on those videos. So one of our customers, Fox, a big customer of ours, right? What they do is they use contractors who record those games. Like live games are being recorded, those contractors will record those games, and those video files they upload into an S3 bucket, right? So contractors are uploading those files into S3 bucket. If you've ever seen like a highlight before, you'll see the highlights are usually happening from different angles, right? If there's a touchdown, you have like 5 different angles of a touchdown, right? All of that content is created by different contractors. They upload those files into S3 bucket, and then Fox uses those files to actually have they create a content around a touchdown or a highlight of the whole game, right? Or highlights of, let's say, the biggest touchdowns that happen, or the biggest throws that happen, right? Or the biggest running plays that happen, right? All that content Fox will create down the road, right? But how do they know today that whatever files are going into their S3 bucket from their contractors is not malicious, right? If it is malicious, what happens is they can't do the work down the road, right? That means that your instant highlight isn't there, right? I usually don't watch instant highlight. What I do is I will go ahead and record the game or watch highlights afterwards on my app, right? Those highlights need to be created, and they're all created through the S3 bucket, right? When we're talking about performance, those video files itself are big. We could talk about 1.2 terabyte files. It used to take Fox about 2 to 3 or 4 minutes to scan one of these files, right? Came down to 25 seconds, right? So performance is key on all this, right? So what I'm going to do is quickly, let's talk about some of that architecture benefit, right? We talked about flexibility, which is, hey, they're scanning files, so any file, right? There's no limitation on what file can be scanned, right? Performance, we just talked about it, 1.2 terabyte file, that's a huge file, right? 25 seconds, yep. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, when I scan a file, what does that actually mean? The files that sit on your computer today, right? They're being scanned by your antivirus, whatever antivirus on your computer, right? The same files, when you put in a S3 bucket, today is not scanned, right? So that transfer that happened from your laptop to that S3 bucket, there is a security gap there, right? So that's what I mean by scanning that file. Great question, though. Yep. Uh, and then availability, because we're using Lambda and S3 buckets, SQS, it's all on demand, right? So you don't have to have your S3 buckets running or in warm condition or anything like that, because one, you're not using all that money for EC2 instances, and these are all on demand, right? Cost is coming down for you, right? But that's a good way of looking at that happy path architecture that we looked at, and having security from the start when developers developing that architecture, all the way down to your S3 buckets and looking at the configurations, right? Now, I've literally just talked about the two pillars from from Cloud One perspective, right? I've talked about conformity, which is your configurations, right? From the start to finish, from when users or when developers are creating code, all the way to when the infrastructure is actually made, right? And on top of that, I talked about S3 bucket, which is going to be scanning those files, right, within S3, that content within S3, right? We have 7 other pillars, 5 other pillars that we can look into as a content. One of them is workload security, right? So that'll go straight on your EC2 instance, right? This is a great way of looking at what different Amazon products relate to security and why you would need them, right? So that being said, I will leave this up, and I'm open to any questions if you guys have. And I know that there is a nacho bar going on, so I definitely cannot compete with that. But yeah, any questions around this? It is. It's not a plugin that installs on S3, but it is a script that you will need to run on your account, so that correct, on your AWS account, so that it can integrate with your S3 and then see when every time you drop in a file, automatically scans. Yep. That's a good question. The question was, is it a plugin? And the answer is it's more around integration. Yep.
What is Sneak giving you in open source that like some of the other providers aren't?
Oh, great question. So the question is, what is Sneak giving us on the open source versus what other providers aren't? Sneak is a great partnership we have with Trend. It's looking at open source vulnerability. So we talk about open source code. A great example of that is like Log4j, right? That was a huge vulnerability that came out last year. When we talk about open source, it means that other developers around the communities are creating that code, right? Anybody can go in and create actually add to that code, right? We don't know if what they added in is malicious or not, right? But when I say malicious, it could be vulnerabilities. Like, let's say I added in code where it's talking to a service in the backend. That's what happened with Log4j. It's talking to a service in the backend, but it didn't check the validation of that talking, right? So anybody could enter a string in the communication from Log4j to the backend, and it will spit out any information that you would want, right? Let's say passwords, right? So that could be a vulnerability because they just forgot to check that instance, right?
Are they pointing to like categories of Awasthi to like help developers remediate in open source?
In open source, the question is if they're looking at OWASP and looking at those categories, right? When developers are developing the code, let's say for Log4j, they're not looking at OWASP itself, because that's more comes into like web application firewall and so forth. But that's all looking at any type of code that's open source that developers are making, and making sure there aren't any vulnerabilities in that code. All right, good question.
My original question was, what are you getting from Sneak that you couldn't get from another open
what we get from Sneak
Yeah, like,
versus.
yeah, as far as the open source, you know, vulnerability discovery, right?
Mhm.
There are other open source solution providers out there as well too, right? So, what made you choose to go with Sneak over like some others? I was just kind of curious if you had identified any.
I think that's I think that's a good question. The question is, what made us choose Sneak over any other provider? There are a lot of providers out there today that are doing open source security. We chose Sneak, I think, mainly because of how well they're doing in security-wise in the startup phase and also development phase. So they have a great relationship with developers and DevOps, and what we give them is the DevSecOps, right? So I think that's why we chose Sneak. Yep, great question. Anyone else? Perfect. Thank you for coming in today. Hope you guys learned.